Questions without notice. The member for McMahon.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. On April 15, the Prime Minister said that at least 40% of the Australian population would need to download the COVID-Safe app for it to work. Can the Prime Minister update the House on what proportion of the population have downloaded the app and what steps the government has taken to encourage further take-up?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. That reference was made after some discussions we'd had with the Singaporean government about the app that had run in Singapore. We had taken with their gift the code that had been used for the Trace Together app, as the Australian Minister, I'm sure, is aware. While we have no real target, what is important is that as many people download the COVID-Safe app as is possible, and I thank all members of this place for their cooperation in sending a common message out to Australians that this is one of the key protections that are needed to be in place as we go back into our economy, into our society. As restrictions are eased, this is one of the key protections that are in place, and some 5.6 million, just over that, have now downloaded that app. There's a total population, I should say, of those who could download the app of around 16 million. So I'll allow the member to do the maths, which is just around about a third of that population that so far has downloaded that app. And recently I was part of a regular group that is now gathering of what are called first movers around various countries who've had some success in our battle against the virus, and there has been great interest in Australia's success to date with this app. We're only just around 2 weeks down with this app, and in other countries they have been in place for months. In Singapore's case, and has still not reached the levels that we have here in Australia. So we remain confident that as we continue to work together and encourage Australians to download the COVID-Safe app, we will continue to see those numbers rise, and that will continue to ensure that there are protections in place for Australians as they move around. Australians would have seen the significant investment we've made in those communications plans. People have seen that on their television screens and their newspapers. They've seen it in social media. They've seen it endorsed by important groups, and particularly nurses, and we recognise International Nurses Day today, who've given a strong support, who stood with the Minister, along with the Australian Medical Association President, giving that strong endorsement. But not only that, the tech community has also given it very strong praise when it comes to the safety that's around this app. And this is important because we wanted this app to work as an invitation to Australians to participate in ensuring these protections were in place. And particularly now that restrictions are easing, we would further encourage Australians to do this. While many Australians would have been at home and the only people they may have seen were their household family members and the pets, Mr Speaker, now as they go back out into the community, they will come across more people. And to protect those people and protect themselves and to protect their family, I would continue to encourage Australians to download the COVID-Safe app today.
Just very briefly, make sure that it's very clear on indulgence.
Sorry, I just haven't given you the call yet, so if I just give the Leader of the Opposition the call.
Labor joins with the Prime Minister in calling upon Australians to download the app.
And I call the member for Higgins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister outline to the House how the Morrison government is continuing to act on its plan to protect lives and livelihoods from the coronavirus pandemic and its economic effects?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And I thank the member for Higgins for her question and again for her strong advice and encouragement during the course of our response to the Health Minister and myself and so many others, given her experience in these and many other areas. Can I also again acknowledge International Nurses Day today, Mr Speaker? This is an important day to recognise those who are out there right now protecting all Australians and showing the care that is needed to assist so many, particularly those, although they be very few in number, who are in our ICUs today as a result of the response that we've had to the COVID-19 crisis. They are still there and they will be there no matter what the challenge is that comes to Australia on this matter. Now, Mr Speaker, as the COVID-19 outbreak started, going back into early January, the government has had a very clear plan as to our response. The first point in that plan has always been to fight the virus and to take the medical advice about how we can achieve that. And together as a country we are winning when it comes to addressing the COVID-19 pandemic here in Australia. We have seen, with the great cooperation and efforts of the states and territories, we have been able to flatten that curve. We have been able to reduce the growth in the case numbers, and we have, importantly, been able to put the protections in place: increased ICU capacity, increased availability of PPE, testing kits, the COVID-safe app, which I've just been asked about. All of these things providing the protections against the COVID-19 virus, and to ensure that we are now in a position around the world as one of the most COVID-safe countries and certainly of developed economies anywhere in the world. An Australian story is one that Australians can be proud of when it comes to responding to this issue, and we did that by fighting the virus and ensuring that we took the right steps, from closing borders to putting the health steps in place, to putting restrictions in place, to ensure that we could get on top of the virus and put ourselves into a position. And that, of course, led at the same time to ensure we extended an economic lifeline right across Australia through the JobKeeper and the JobSeeker program, the doubling, effectively, of the JobSeeker payment through the COVID supplement. Mr Speaker, the cash flow measures that the Treasurer went through today in his statement to the House, providing that important lifeline to get Australians through the worst of this crisis. And then, last Friday, and in the weeks that preceded that, the National Cabinet moving together with a clear three-step process to reopen the Australian economy. But we must move carefully and cautiously, states and territories moving at their own pace, and we must not be complacent. The virus is not defeated. It's certainly still out there, and we cannot be complacent, and we must remain on our guard. And having done that, Mr Speaker, and that is rolled out, we rebuild the confidence and the momentum, and we reset for growth, because it's the growth of our economy that will ensure that we can continue to guarantee the essential services Australians rely on, that we get the jobs back into our economy, that we keep Australians safe, and we can look after this amazing country we call our own.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. In what year will unemployment return to pre-coronavirus levels?
The Treasurer has the call.
Mr Speaker, we on this side of the House are doing everything we can to keep unemployment as low as possible, Mr Speaker. And as the Leader of the Opposition is aware, and I've made public in my statement today, the forecast from Treasury is that unemployment will reach around 10%. That's a doubling of unemployment in the June quarter. Now, Mr Speaker, when we came to government, unemployment was 5.7%, but in February it fell to 5.1%. Then the economy was struck by the economic impact of the coronavirus. So, Mr Speaker, we are doing everything we can to maintain that formal connection between employers and employees. The JobKeeper package at $130 billion with 5.5 million employees currently covered.
The Treasurer is entitled to a preamble, but the question was very specific. So I'll just draw him back to the question.
Mr Speaker, it will take some time before unemployment comes back to the pre-coronavirus levels. But what I do know is that we are doing everything we can to keep people in a job and businesses in business.
The member for Bennelong.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister update the House on implementation of the National Cabinet's agreed three-step plan to reopen a COVID-safe Australia and economy?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Bennelong for his question, Mr Speaker. And can I also, at the commencement of this answer, that three-step plan that was announced last Friday, that is now being implemented by the states and territories, would not have been possible without the work that was done to put the protections in place, from the closing of the borders early in February through to the work that has been done to get access to the personal protective equipment, the testing kits, the COVID-safe app, all of this getting the protections in place. But critical amongst that was the amazing discipline and support shown by the Chinese-Australian community. And I know the member for Bennelong, as so many represent here, represent those Australians. And their initial lockdown and isolation in response to the COVID-19 virus was something extraordinary and set the tone and example for all other Australians to follow. And I know the member for Bennelong would be very proud of his community to that end, as the member for Chisholm would, and so many others, Mr Speaker. Last Friday, we announced that three-step plan, the first step being to carefully reopen our economy, and that process is now well underway as we're allowing gatherings of up to 10 people. This has been a very difficult thing for the Australians to live with in recent months, but their patience has paid off, and we thank them for that patience as we now move to reopen the Australian economy. The second step moves to another level of reopening of the Australian economy, and that particularly draws on the wisdom and experience of businesses and industry to develop their COVID-safe plans. When Australians are returning to work, as we are here in this place, as we have been working in our own electorate offices or other places around the country, but returning to this parliament, this COVID-safe arrangements are being put in place, and I particularly want to commend the work that has been done by the Minister for Industrial Relations and the Attorney-General, working together with Greg Combet and the COVID Commission that has been working to ensure that there are Safe Work Australia guidelines and protocols to be followed to ensure that Australians can return to work in a safe way. We're seeing children back at school. We're seeing those in-classroom learnings undertaken again, as I know the Minister for Education and I are very pleased about. That is the best place for children to learn, in a classroom. And we may lose many things throughout the course of this COVID-19 crisis, but we have taken all steps we can to ensure that a year's worth of a children's education is not lost, and I welcome the decisions that have been taken by the states and territories. The third step really goes to the next level of getting us to a place in July where we can have a COVID-safe economy, where we're seeing Australians back in jobs, businesses open again, and we are at a whole new level of our economy operating, and we will see more and more Australians in a position to be supported by the economy and not by the taxpayer. Because at the end of the day, Mr Speaker, this government has no other funds than those that are provided by the Australian people. And we are grateful of that support, Mr Speaker, and the hard work of Australians and businesses who provided that taxation revenue, and we will ensure that it's always put to the best possible use in supporting Australians at this time.
The member for Rankin.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is for the Treasurer. In what year will Australia's gross debt start to decline?
The Treasurer.
Mr Speaker, the member for Rankin wants us to announce forecasts tonight, as we would normally do on budget night. And the reality is there's great uncertainty in the economic environment, and therefore when it comes to forecasts about debt, when it comes to forecasts about unemployment, we make those on budget night. What we have done today is to provide a ministerial statement to the House with new numbers for the member for Rankin around business investment, around dwelling investment, around consumption. The member for Rankin was out this morning asking for a statement with numbers and facts and figures. It was all there for him, Mr Speaker. It was all there for him. And, Mr Speaker, the reality is it's a very difficult economic time and a very uncertain economic time.
The member for Clark.
Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, Tasmanians are still being ripped off at the Bowser. Higher freight costs and little competition don't explain why motorists yesterday paid 30 cents a litre more in Hobart than in Melbourne, or why Tasmanians paid over $12 million in excess fuel costs since March. Yes, the ACCC has looked at this before and will look at it again. But that's meaningless so long as the Commission is a toothless bystander. So, Prime Minister, will you be the one to finally fix this? Will your government give the ACCC the power to intervene and to rein in the fuel industry, and everyone else for that matter, treating consumers like mugs?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for his question. This is a matter that goes to the ACCC, as you've indicated in your question, so I'll ask the Treasurer to respond specifically.
The Treasurer.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for his question. The ACCC monitors petrol prices on a daily basis and can take court action in the event that there's uncompetitive conduct, Mr Speaker. I can inform the member but that between the 1st of March and the 10th of May this year, petrol prices across Tasmania fell by 21% and by 22% in Hobart. Now, Mr Speaker, as the honourable member knows, petrol prices in Tasmania are typically around 15 cents higher than the national average. The ACCC has found that is due to higher transport costs, higher operational costs, higher retail margins. On the 16th of December last year, Mr Speaker, the government renewed its direction to the ACCC to monitor the prices, the costs and the profits relating to the supply of fuel products in Australia for a further 3 years. I'd encourage all those Australians to shop around, Mr Speaker, and get the best possible deal.
The members on my left, the member for Lingiari, the member for Dawson has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. Will the Deputy Prime Minister inform the House how the Morrison-McCormack government is ensuring regional Australia is in a strong position to recover from the coronavirus pandemic?
The Deputy Prime Minister.
Yeah, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Dawson for his question, Mr Speaker. Whenever there is a crisis such as this, regional Australia gets hit first and gets hit hardest. And that said, regional Australia very much pulls its weight whenever there is a crisis in ensuring that the nation gets through it. And the regional Australians are doing their bit. Anecdotal evidence only, Mr Speaker, I know that so many people have downloaded the app, have told me that they're downloading the COVID Safe app, and that is encouraging, and I encourage them to encourage others to do just that. Mr Speaker, we've put in place measures to assist rural and regional Australia, and albeit that agriculture and infrastructure and resources has continued, despite us being homebound, in many cases housebound. Mr Speaker, rural and regional Australians have certainly been those who have been able. They've been getting out and helping this recovery effort. We've put in place, Mr Speaker, the International Air Freight Mechanism and twice-weekly flights of Tasmanian salmon to Taiwan. The $110 million measure has ensured twice-weekly flights of Western Australian rock lobster to China. 25 flights with 42 tonnes of lamb out of Melbourne to markets in Dubai, Kuwait, Jordan, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Mr Speaker, and I know the Minister for Regional Communications on April 21 announced the latest round of the Mobile Black Spots program. And, Mr Speaker, there was $34 million announced, the bulk of which will be announced in round 5A. But if there's one person who knows, Mr Speaker, how important it is to receive texts, how important it is to receive text, no matter where you are, Mr Speaker, whether it's in regional New South Wales, Mr Speaker, from someone's farm, Mr Speaker, if you want to send a text to somebody, it's so important that you can both send a text and, Mr Speaker, indeed share it with somebody, Mr Speaker. And I know the value of that, and I'm sure that all members in this House understand the value of being able to send, receive and indeed share texts. Mr Speaker, the Relief and Recovery Fund, Mr Speaker, at Wagga Wagga on March 28 I announced the $198 million measure for regional airlines, Mr Speaker. And I know how important that's been to ensure regular flights to those 138 centres which would otherwise, Mr Speaker, have been left literally high and dry, stranded because of COVID-19. And, Mr Speaker, also the $100 million underwriting programs which has been so valued by those regionally based airlines. Mr Speaker, tourism projects, I know vulnerable artists. I heard the member for Grayndler talk about artists before, and I share that view with him. We need to make sure that, particularly for regional Australia, their events, their artists are well protected and well covered, and, Mr Speaker, that $1 billion relief and recovery effort is doing just that.
Might just help if the Deputy Prime Minister ensures his phone's on silent. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Does the Prime Minister regret saying that the budget was already back in black?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition may have an ability that I don't have, Mr Speaker, and that is a crystal ball to see into the future and see that the coronavirus was going to impact on the Australian economy, Mr Speaker. And every time we have spoken about the economy, we have done it on the basis of the knowledge that we have and the certainties that are present at that time, Mr Speaker. And it is indeed the case, as the mid-year economic statement showed in December, that that's where the budget was. And at that time, Mr Speaker, we were already in that position, and that's where we were going, Mr Speaker. And I can tell you that the reason we are in a position to having already brought the budget back to balance, and we're on that way to that surplus, Mr Speaker, was because of the painstaking work that our government did over 6 years. Now, Mr Speaker, this is an important issue because our government has already demonstrated our ability after major crises to actually do the work and get budgets back into the positive position, Mr Speaker, and to ensure that we can get debt down, Mr Speaker. And when you're hit by a crisis, as we have, and I remember standing in this place last year, Mr Speaker, when those opposite were encouraging us to spend and spend and spend. And I came to this dispatch box, Mr Speaker, and I said we must be careful because we don't know what can happen in the future and the shocks that the Australian economy may be hit by. Well, that's exactly what happened, Mr Speaker. If we'd followed the prescription of those opposite, Mr Speaker, we would have impaired the budget and we would not have been in the position that the Treasurer and I and the government have been into to extend the largest economic lifeline to this country we have ever seen. We were able to do that from a position of confidence because we had spent 6 years ensuring that we got the budget under control, that we moved from a time when we inherited from the Labor Party debt growing.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The member for Lingiari. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It was a very clear question.
Yeah, you just need to go to the point of order and please don't repeat it.
It goes to relevance. The Prime Minister hasn't answered the question of whether he regrets saying the budget was already back in black.
The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. That's just before I call the Prime Minister. It was a short question, and I know in the Leader of the Opposition's mind it was very specific, but when you ask about something, whether you regret something, it's pretty hard for me to curtail the answer. So, the Prime Minister is in order.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The point I was about to make is when we came to government, debt was growing at 30% a year. And, Mr Speaker, prior to this crisis, we had brought that back down to a growth rate around about zero, Mr Speaker. And we did that over 6 years. But I'm asked about regrets, Mr Speaker. I can tell you one thing. The Australian people don't have regrets about what they did on May 19 last year, Mr Speaker, because of the decisions and actions that have been taken by this government, Mr Speaker. It has ensured that we'll be able to move through what has been a 100-year event, and we remain focused on providing the leadership and the direction to ensure that we can continue to do that. And we've extended the economic lifeline and will be in a position through our careful economic management to ensure that we grow our economy and we ensure that we put as little burden on future generations as is absolutely necessary to ensure Australia gets through this crisis.
The member for Leichhardt.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer update the House on the Morrison government's response to the economic impacts of the coronavirus pandemic and outline how the government is building a bridge to recovery?
The Treasurer.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Leichhardt for his question and acknowledge that in his electorate around half of his local economy is supported by tourism, Mr Speaker, the Great Barrier Reef and other wonderful national parks. And the impact of the coronavirus has been devastating on Australia's tourism sector, not just because the international borders are being closed, but also because of the restrictions and limitation on domestic travel, Mr Speaker. So our thoughts are with the people of Leichhardt as it is with Australians right around the country. Mr Speaker, we are in the midst of a 100-year event with the coronavirus. It's a health and an economic shock like this country has never seen before. The fact that some 4 million people globally have contracted the virus, 280,000 lives have been lost in the United States, 80,000 lives have been lost in the United Kingdom, 31,000 lives have been lost. But through our early response and the wonderful work of our health professionals and our health system, tragically 97 people have lost their lives here in Australia. But we haven't had the had the same number of cases as many other comparable nations. In terms of the economic shock, it's been significant, with the Australian Treasury forecasting GDP to fall by around 10% in the June quarter, the largest fall on record, unemployment to fall to reach around 10%, a doubling of the unemployment rate. Mr Speaker, our response has been comprehensive in scale and in scope and is unprecedented in terms of the amount of fiscal financial support that is making its way into Australian households and Australian businesses. Our JobKeeper program has seen 5.5 million employees to date be covered by those businesses that are formally enrolled in that program. Our cash flow boost, a $32 billion program, has already seen over $8.5 billion go out the door to nearly 500,000 businesses. Our $750 cash payments, Mr Speaker, has seen $5.2 billion go to 7 million Australians on income support, pensioners, people with a Commonwealth Seniors Health Card, disability support pension, Mr Speaker, veterans, those on family tax benefits. And, Mr Speaker, we've also given people access to their own money through the super system, Mr Speaker, and some $11 billion has been accessed tax-free by the Australian people. And, Mr Speaker, the progress that was made by the National Cabinet to see a gradual easing of restrictions has been estimated to contribute over $9 billion a month to the Australian economy. So Australians need to follow the health advice. Mr Speaker, Australians need to get back to work, and that will be good news for the Australian economy.
The member for Hotham has the call.
Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Why does the Prime Minister say the economy will snap back after the coronavirus crisis when the Reserve Bank is forecasting unemployment as high as 9% at Christmas?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Speaker, I would have to correct the member. She may not have read the transcript carefully of those comments that were made back in April. What I was referring to was the other side of the 6-month period, Mr Speaker, and that was the change that would need to occur regarding the temporary measures we've put in place for JobKeeper and for businesses to be able to restart, Mr Speaker. And that is certainly my hope. But back in April there was a knowledge of economic issues as they were at that time, and that has changed since then, Mr Speaker. There is no doubt about that. And reference is made to the Reserve Bank Governor. Well, the Reserve Bank Governor was with the Treasurer in Saudi Arabia early this year, in February of this year, Mr Speaker, and even at that time the full implications of the COVID-19 crisis were not known. And some weeks later, the outlook in relation to the nature of the recovery that would occur had changed dramatically. And it had gone from V-shape to U-shape, Mr Speaker, and it is still not clear. So, Mr Speaker, the opposition is, of course, at liberty to go back and refer to comments that were made back in April, and that is fine. But they cannot do so without adding the further context of the statements the government has made since that time, taking into account more recent information. But I can say this, I am looking forward to the time, Mr Speaker, and under our policies we will be moving there as quickly as we can, where businesses can reopen, because that is the objective, Mr Speaker, and that employees can come back into their businesses and children will be back in all of their schools getting their lessons in the classroom. That is good news. I know businesses want to be able to do that, Mr Speaker, that they can go back into the arrangements they were in before as soon as they can. That is the point of the reopening of the economy. And what I would caution this chamber about, Mr Speaker, is getting complacent about the challenge that is still ahead. Australians right now are still facing an economy in which many are without employment, where businesses are still closed. And while it is important to look ahead, right now our government remains very focused right here, right now, on the needs of Australians and the economic pain that they are going through. And that's why the JobKeeper program is in place. That's why the Job Seeker program is in place. That's why the cash flow assistance is in place. That's why we've relaxed restrictions for those who've had a shock to their income to be able to access their own savings, their own money, Mr Speaker, at a time when they really need it to help them get through, Mr Speaker, a point which I know those opposite disagree with, but it's one that is helping Australians to get through. Our focus is building that bridge. Our focus has been to work with premiers and chief ministers around the country to have a coordinated plan to get Australia through what is one of our most difficult times, Mr Speaker. So the opposition might want to pick that word on that word or that word. They are entitled to do that and do those things, Mr Speaker. They can look at my words, they can look at their own words, they can look at anyone's words. What I'm looking at, Mr Speaker, is the need to get Australians back into work.
Time has concluded. I call the member for Bass.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. Noting that today is International Nurses Day, will the minister outline to the House how the Morrison government is responding to the coronavirus pandemic to ensure that we are flattening the curve?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Bass, who has been a great advocate for the health professionals and the nurses in her electorate and around the country. In particular, on this International Nurses Day, we remember and we acknowledge the fact that our nurses are there at our birth and so often at our death. They are there at many of the most profound and important moments in our lives, and they have been there during the course of this pandemic at the front line of Australia's response to coronavirus. And when the member asks how Australia's been able to respond, we've only been able to respond because of the help, the work, the support, the courage of our nurses, our doctors, our pathologists, our allied health workers, our pharmacists, and all of those involved in the protection of our citizens. We've only been able to respond because of the contribution of the Australian population, who have taken on board themselves the difficult social distancing measures, the isolation both physically but sometimes emotionally. But at the same time they have backed and supported each other. And we've been able to respond because of the National Cabinet, which the Prime Minister built in conjunction with the Premiers and the Chief Ministers, acting as a single national body guiding our actions. And those actions, as a government, have included our containment measures, in particular our border controls, beginning on the 1st of February with the difficult and challenging closure of the border with China, but which was the right thing to do, with our testing, with well over 800,000 tests in what is described by the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine as being at the global forefront of accuracy for global testing. Our containment through tracing and now the work of the app, which adds to the work of our public health officials, and the isolation measures all coming together. But in terms of our capacity, what we've done is boost our primary health care services. We've introduced telehealth with over 8.5 million telehealth services that have supported Australians who might otherwise have been isolated whilst protecting our healthcare professionals. We have supported our aged care workers who have been absolute heroes during this crisis. And when one compares what has occurred overseas with what's occurred here, they have saved lives and protected lives. And we've boosted the capacity of our hospital services. 20,000 nurses have enrolled and over 5,500 have completed ICU training, with the rest on their way. Another 3,000 are on their way to returning, with 77% of those have completed their work. So today we say to our nurses, we thank you, we honour you, and you, along with others, are the reason Australia has helped flatten that curve.
The member for Rankin.
Thanks very much, Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer, and it refers to the answer that the Prime Minister just gave about snapback. Given what the Prime Minister has just said, does the Treasurer stand by his comment on the 13th of March, and I quote, "The Prime Minister was very strong on how there would be a snapback. They were his words. The economy would snap back."
The Treasurer.
Mr Speaker, I stand by all my words, Mr Speaker, including that the Australian economy is better served by those on this side of the House, Mr Speaker. And the reality is, Mr Speaker, that the Reserve Bank, as recently as last Friday, in its statement on monetary policy, said beyond the next few months, the speed and timing of the economic recovery is very uncertain. This uncertainty makes it extremely difficult to formulate reliable economic and fiscal estimates over the next few months. Now, Mr Speaker, we are doing everything we can to support the Australian economy by cushioning the blow with an effective doubling of the old New Start, now the Job Seeker payment, Mr Speaker, with the JobKeeper program at $130 billion, the most significant economic lifeline this country has ever seen. Mr Speaker, I ask myself, why does the member for Rankin keep talking down the Australian economy instead of joining the BCA, who said that our announcement was a country-saving moment? ACOS, Mr Speaker, and Vecchi and other chambers who praised the government's announcement, Mr Speaker, and Deloitte Access Economics with Chris Richardson, who recently just said about the JobKeeper payment that it was a game-changer. Mr Speaker, we on this side of the House are doing everything we can to keep Australians in jobs and businesses in business.
The member for Boothby.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Education. Will the Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government is ensuring Australia's children are getting the best possible education during the coronavirus pandemic?
The Minister for Education.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Boothby for her question, and I know she'll be very pleased with the fact that 87.6% of students were at school yesterday in South Australia, and 99.2% of childcare services are open in South Australia. Now, that is quite an achievement when you think where we were 2 months ago when this pandemic started to hit. The fact that we've been able to provide that continuity of education right through the last 2 months when it comes to childcare, when it comes to schools, is something this nation should be extraordinarily proud of. And when it comes to the approach that the government has taken, what we have done is based all our policies on the expert medical advice. We have listened to the AHPPC, and they've said right throughout this pandemic that it's been safe for our schools to be open with the right protocols in place, and it's been safe for our childcare centres to be open with the right protocols in place. And, Mr Speaker, that's why we put in place our $1.6 billion early childhood education and care relief package, because we wanted to make sure that we were providing the assistance that was needed for our childcare sector so they could remain open throughout this pandemic. And can I say to all those early childhood educators who have been there in those childcare centres providing that continuity of care, a very big thank you on behalf of the nation. You've made sure, especially for those vulnerable children who needed that continuity of care and the children of those essential workers, that there was a place where they could go, it was a centre that they knew, and they could get the care that they needed. When it comes to schools, everyone in this House should also be incredibly pleased to know that every state and territory now has a plan to ensure our schools are open to face-to-face teaching right across this nation, and that will occur by early June. Obviously, some states we're already seeing that, but now right across the nation, every state and territory has a plan in place for that face-to-face teaching. Once again, something we should be incredibly proud of, that we've been able to achieve this given what we've been hit with in the last 2 months by this coronavirus pandemic. And we are going to make sure that that continuity of education not only delivers for students this year, but also when it comes to the future, because in particular for our Year 12 students, we know that they now need the certainty to be able to get that ATAR outcome that they want and to be able to go on to higher education, to be able to go on to vocational education, or to be able to go on and get a job.
The member for Whitlam.
Thanks, Speaker. My question's to the Treasurer. Treasurer, how many Australians are now earning more than their normal wage because they're receiving the JobKeeper wage subsidy of $1,500 per fortnight?
The Treasurer.
Mr Speaker, I'd have to take that question on notice. I don't actually have that number available. But what I can tell, the honourable member is that we decided on a flat $1,500 payment because, and it was a very Australian way to do it. We didn't want it because we didn't want to see a situation if you earned more that you would get a greater payment, and that is unlike the United Kingdom scheme. And I was advised by Treasury of the limitations of that scheme. And at $130 billion, this is a very significant support for the economy at a very difficult time.
The member for Ford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Minister for Industry, Science and Technology. Will the Minister please update the House on how Australian industry is responding to the challenge of the coronavirus pandemic and how industry is benefiting from the JobKeeper payment?
The Minister for Industry, Science and Technology.
Thank you, and I thank the member for his question. Mr Speaker, the coronavirus pandemic has presented challenges on an unprecedented scale for Australian industry, and their resilience has been absolutely outstanding. Mr Speaker, Australian industry has been able to respond to the rapidly changing situation because they have been backed and supported by a range of measures, most importantly our JobKeeper payment. Now, the member for Ford would be pleased to know that in our home state of Queensland we have the wonderful example of Packer Leather, a fifth-generation Australian business, a family business, a manufacturing business, and they are delighted that the JobKeeper payment has meant that they are able to keep their 100 local staff. Now, this company was established in 1891, so they have survived the Spanish flu, 2 world wars, the Great Depression, the rise of plastics, foreign competition, offshore manufacturing and a number of recessions. Today, that company is an international leader in the production of high-performance leathers with a reputation for quality and innovation. And they're a great example of the Australian fighting spirit and the sort of businesses that JobKeeper is assisting. Now, Mr Speaker, since the crisis began, I've been working with Australian industry, holding a number of roundtables and speaking directly with CEOs from right across Australia. Our underlying goal has been ensuring that as many businesses as possible continue to keep Australians in jobs, and JobKeeper has been vital to that. Beyond that, our priority has been making sure that supply chains are secure and that we can maintain vital supplies and services. Mr Speaker, we've seen factories working around the clock to restock supermarket shelves. We've seen manufacturers pivot and adapt to produce the essential medical supplies that we need, including gowns, masks, gloves, sanitisers. And we've seen the Australian business community act as one, leaving rivalry and their own economic interests at the front door as they put the nation first. Mr Speaker, it's been both our duty and our privilege to support them with JobKeeper. We've been able to deliver that because of our strong economic management. Now, Mr Speaker, you will find the frontline heroes of Australia's coronavirus response in our hospitals, but backing them at every step have been industry and workforce heroes. You will find them on the farm, on the factory floor. You'll find them in a cab of a truck and behind the supermarket checkout. For their dedication during this crisis, we say thank you. We are proud to back you during this challenging time. You are vital to Australia's post-COVID recovery.
The member for Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. What does the Treasurer have to say to the 1 in 3 hospitality workers who've lost their job, the 1 in 4 workers in the arts and entertainment industries who've lost their jobs, up to 11,000 casual workers in Eden Monero who can't access JobKeeper, 21,000 university workers who are likely to lose their jobs over coming months, and the thousands of workers at Donata whose jobs are at risk, who are now facing the unemployment queue because the government won't extend the JobKeeper wage subsidy to more workers?
The Treasurer.
Well, Mr Speaker, this is a very difficult time for Australians. A very, very difficult time for the Australian economy. and it's a devastating global pandemic with a major economic shock. Now, as a result, this government has acted decisively and comprehensively with $320 billion worth of economic support, equivalent to 16.4% of GDP. Now, Mr Speaker, when it comes to the JobKeeper program, the forecasts were for around 6 million people to access it. And as the Prime Minister has said to the House, and I've said today, currently, based on the 800,000 plus businesses that are formally applied to the JobKeeper program, that covers around 5.5 million Australian workers. And as I said in my ministerial statement, more than 1 million people are on the job seeker payment, Mr Speaker. And as the honourable member will know, we've effectively doubled the previous support through New Start with a $550 job seeker coronavirus supplement. Mr Speaker, these are temporary, these are targeted, these are proportionate measures. And when it comes to the JobKeeper program, and when it comes to the cash flow boost, and when it comes to the early access to superannuation, and when it comes to the $750 cash payment, we've seen more than $25 billion go out the door. Now, Mr Speaker, the Secretary of Treasury, well known to those opposite, respected by both sides of this House, said to the COVID Senate committee that the money is running out remarkably quickly, Mr Speaker, and that is the point. We are doing everything we can through the existing systems to get the financial support to the people who need it most.
The member for Lyne.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Agriculture, Drought and Emergency Management. Will the Minister provide an update to the House on the Morrison government's continued support for bushfire-affected communities, noting any additional challenges to these efforts?
The Minister for Agriculture, Drought and Emergency Management.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. And can I say, despite the challenges of COVID-19, the government and the Bushfire Recovery Agency has not forgotten those victims in this summer's bushfires. We've continued to work, and yesterday we committed the last $650 million of the $2 billion recovery fund. Now, that's in addition to those relief payments that were put out immediately, the $1,000 per adult, $400 per child, which we doubled. And in fact, proudly, that program that we administered through the Department of Human Services was able to be done for the majority of those and have it in their pockets within 40 minutes, something that I think we as Australians should be very proud to help those in their time of need to get money into their pockets. But yesterday we took the next step. But what we're also proud of is that, as of yesterday, we had spent $537 million of the $2 billion. That has come out of the Australian government's pocket and put it into the victims' pockets. $537 million of the $2 billion. We said we would only have $500 million spent by the 30th of June, but such is the demand and need that we have continued to work with the states in a collaborative way to get this money out, and we expect that by the 30th of June we will have probably spent over $1 billion of that $2 billion fund. That will be out of the government's pocket into those victims' pocket. So that's something that we as a government and we as a nation should be proud of, that we're there to support those in their time of need. But yesterday was a strategic move around moving from immediate relief to long-term recovery. And the centrepiece of that was nearly a $450 million investment in local economic recovery plans. This recovery cannot be Canberra-led. It has to be led locally. And that's what we're trying to do, is empower those communities with the tools to do that. Let them decide what building back better looks like. Not someone from Canberra or Sydney or Melbourne, but somebody that's ensconced in that community, that's living and breathing it. So we've said to those communities, we are there to help. We've also invested nearly another $150 million in the environment, on top of the $50 million that we put out in emergency funds to help those injured species straight after the fires. We're now going to rebuild their habitat. We're also looking to improve telecommunications, with $27 million worth of improved telecommunications, which we found there were gaps during the bushfires. It's important we acknowledge that, work with telcos and try to make it better for the future, to protect more lives, more Australians. Another $15 million for the forestry industry. It's been hit probably harder than most. In understanding the forestry industry, you just don't plant a tree and you're able to harvest it within 12 months. It takes 20+ years. So we needed to give them support to get them through. But one of the most important aspects of this package is the top-up to mental health. $13.5 million to have locally targeted mental health programs for those communities that have been impacted. People across the fire zone are healing at different stages, and we need to understand that and tailor that. But we need to say to them there should never be a stigma to ask for help. This nation, this parliament will stand with you in your economic but also your emotional recovery.
The member for Bendigo.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. How much money has the government given to businesses which are receiving the JobKeeper payment, using them to subsidise their balance sheet whilst employees are running down their leave entitlements?
The Treasurer.
Mr Speaker, with respect to the honourable member's question, the whole purpose of the JobKeeper payment is to keep people in work by reducing the cost of labour, Mr Speaker, and it is helping businesses at a very difficult time. It's maintaining the formal connection between the employer and employee. More than $2 billion has already gone out the door under the JobKeeper payment, and more will go out in coming weeks.
The member for Fisher.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for the Environment. Will the Minister please outline to the House the work that the Morrison government is doing to restore Australia's native wildlife and their habitats following the bushfires, the devastating bushfires? Thank you.
The Minister for the Environment.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Fisher for his question and also for his advocacy for his electorate. He introduced me to the fabulous Terry Irwin from Australia Zoo on a visit in January, and I know that she is standing by for our zoos and aquariums package designed to help organisations that exhibit native wildlife. And I know she was talking about opening her zoo in a COVID-safe manner, because the jobs and the communities and the activities that are deeply and inextricably linked with our natural environment are certainly front and centre when it comes to the announcements that the Morrison government has made this week. Notwithstanding the pandemic, we've not forgotten the savage impact of the bushfires on our native wildlife and landscapes, with 12 million hectares burnt. In January, the Treasurer and I announced $50 million, but we said it was a down payment. It was for that emergency rescue and recovery, and more would come. And the Morrison government this week has fulfilled that commitment with a further $150 million to do the heavy lifting when it comes to rehabilitation and long-term recovery of our natural landscapes. Now, this will be delivered through partnerships with land managers, community groups, seed banks, conservation volunteers, Indigenous Australians, all dedicated to on-the-ground recovery action. It will be science-led. We've had an expert panel led by a Threatened Species Commissioner. They've been meeting quietly and confidently. They've listed 119 animals, 471 plants, and through that lens, this fund will be dedicated to recovery. Mr Speaker, on the South Coast, before COVID, I met with environmental rangers connected with their local natural resource management groups to discuss the work they're doing in weed management, cultural burning, rehabilitating coastal salt marsh. Oyster farmers on the Clyde River affected by the silt, of course, is flowing into the river, but will be restricted now with the work that's done to prevent erosion. Deputy PM and I drove through a shattered landscape from Holbrook to Gingellic. That patchwork of farms in the bush with land care, so much of what they do, they too will be helped by this package. We remain committed to help, protect and support the long-term recovery, because we know that by caring for our natural environment, we're also caring for the communities and the economies that rely on it. Our response will help secure the future of treasured native species such as the koala, the kangaroo island dunnet, the northern corroboree frog and amazing plants like the Wallamai pine, Banksias, bottlebrushes, our World Heritage areas in the Blue Mountains and the Gondwana rainforest. As I said, Mr Speaker, the natural world is inextricably linked with the communities that depend on it, and we are here for both.
The Prime Minister.
Speaker, I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.
I thank the Prime Minister.